My name is Renáta Uitz. I teach constitutional law at Central European University, Hungary. My university is a graduate institution. I direct the master's program on comparative constitutional law. Democratic recession sounds, as a term, like some sort of natural disaster that hit you. I argued in my talk and elsewhere that democratic recession is a man-made process. It takes politicians who do not take constitutional ideals seriously, who do not view constitutions as sources of constraints on their powers, and instead they use constitutional and legal rules to self-perpetuate themselves, to legitimize arbitrary rule, and to make sure that they get re-elected as many times as humanly possible in competitive and multi-party but slightly fixed elections. Democratic recession is really difficult to pinpoint because after an initial shock, when you are being told that the constitution will be reinvented in order to make sure that a new Hungarian nation or a new Polish nation finally gets to take over, not much seems to happen. There is legal engineering. You will hear about the judicial reform. You will hear about the media reform. You will hear about higher education reform done through legal means. You will see protests on the streets. And in a few years' time, it becomes your daily normalcy. So the building of a liberal democracy in Hungary happened through constitutional engineering, partly because absolutely unexpectedly, this party coalition won constitution-making majority, and making a new constitution is an extremely important symbolic gesture. But much of the recipe, the judicial reform, the media reform, education reform, can be carried out by statutory changes and even policy changes which are done through executive measures. The really important aspect of the technology is that the governments in these countries are trying to pass such measures which will not be found unconstitutional. So they are trying to tailor the implementation of these grand ideas and these policies to the realities of constitutional or regional human rights control. If you pack your constitutional court, then you don't have to worry about a court or Supreme Court finding the measures unconstitutional. Then your worry is regional opposition from regional human rights bodies or regional organizations. And then the realm of possibilities goes as far as these regional standards permit. In a system like in Brazil, where you did not yet manage to pack the Supreme Court, seemingly there is slightly smaller room for these measures, because you can always expect that the courts will find the measures unconstitutional. At the same time, what you also see in the Brazilian context is that when the president is using provisional measures and the courts respond almost immediately with an interim injunction, that does not put an end to the political conversation about the wisdom of the measure and whether you need to, first of all, do something about the judiciary that dared to stop the measure from becoming reality, and second of all, finding another way which will make this measure possible and constitutional even over the objection of the judiciary. So even when a measure is stopped relatively early, the fact that there is ongoing public conversation about how to do it better next time sends a signal to the subjects of these legal measures that they are unwanted, signals to them that they are in a precarious position, and suggest to them that they should wait, because soon, maybe in a week's time, maybe in a month's time, maybe in a year's time, they should expect that something similar will be passed in a manner that will actually stick. The Hungarian recipe for building an illiberal democracy, and I'm using the label after Prime Minister Viktor Órban, so this is not a scientific term. Started with packing the Constitutional Court. Actually, the packing of the court itself was done in several steps, bit by bit. First, only the rules on nomination of justices were changed, then the rules on, rules on election, and then you gradually come to changing rules on the size of the court, and then changing rules of retirement. And you also do tweaks to the jurisdiction of the court. If you look at the Hungarian Constitutional Court on paper, you will be really surprised, because it, on paper, has very wide jurisdiction. It even gets to test the constitutionality of constitutional amendments. That is, in world comparison, quite a serious jurisdiction, but the devil is always in the details, so you have to look at who gets to actually approach the Constitutional Court in which types of matters, and also to see what the Constitutional Court can review. So, for instance, with constitutional amendments, they can only review the procedural propriety of the amendment process, but the court itself cannot review the contents of constitutional amendments. One of the big change in the Hungarian early phases of packing the Constitutional Court was removing the opportunity of anyone to turn with a constitutional issue to the court. This is known as actio popularis. Now, this is not a type of jurisdiction that constitutional courts would have in any country. In Hungary, at the time, it meant limiting individual access to the court radically. So the result is that the court becomes extremely difficult to approach for private individuals, for violations of fundamental rights. The new procedure for individual constitutional complaint is actually very hard to use, and the court uses its discretionary powers in order to keep these petitions at the absolute minimum. Once you pack the court, of course, it's much easier to pass legislation that is at least dubious in a constitutional sense. So when the Polish regime came into power after the 2015 elections, packing the Constitutional Court was among the first major measures that they undertook, and this permitted the Polish government to pass such legislation, including a judicial reform, that would have been unconstitutional according to many lawyers in the country, but not according to the packed Constitutional Court anymore. It is part of the illiberal recipe that once you manage to pack the Constitutional Court, you really don't even need to make constitution-level changes anymore. The Hungarian illiberal government had constitution-making majorities, so they passed a new constitution. This is called a fundamental law, and they amended it several times. In the Polish case, the government doesn't have constitution-making majority, so they need to do changes on the statutory level. It's really crucial that both governments essentially managed to do a wholesale judicial reform without having to do much more than pass a series of statutes. So one important lesson is that a judicial reform from top to bottom, including judicial self-administration, can be done on a statutory level, so long as these governments can be sure that these statutes will not be found unconstitutional, or at least the key core provisions will not be found unconstitutional. I consider it to be an essential feature of these reforms that you fiddle with judicial self-government. This is the aspect of the judicial system that has major impact on judicial appointments, promotions, and also judicial discipline. In Poland, disciplining the judges is an internal procedure which is excessively used in order to make sure that those judges who would be ruling against the government stay silent and they understand their place in the system. The judicial reforms are very often accompanied by other criminal procedural reforms. The Hungarian government was in favor of reinstating real-life punishment, and something that is also very similar with Brazil. In Hungary, there is an emphasis on reforming juvenile justice, trying to try juvenile offenders according to the rules which are very similar to how you would treat adults. So the judicial reform very often comes hand in hand with the criminal procedure reform, because a tough on crime attitude is very important for reinventing the nation according to the mission of an illiberal government. Now, prosecutorial discretion is not a nasty word. In every democracy, prosecutors do get to decide who they charge, what they charge them with, and when is it that they decide not to bring charges for a particular set of facts. However, when you see that particular types of crimes, for instance, crimes related to funny ways of spending public money are systematically not prosecuted, then you have a sense of prosecutorial discretion being abused across a number of cases. Also, when prosecutions are opened against members of the previous civil service or political parties which are not in power anymore, you have the sense that prosecutorial discretion is being abused. Very often in these regimes, these open prosecutions do not ever get to criminal cases. So the manner in which you use prosecution to keep people on their toes is to simply open the criminal procedure, leave the prosecution pending for a few months or even a few years, and then decide to drop charges without actually going into trial. This is sufficient to cast doubt over the private lives and reputations of the persons who are allegedly committing criminal acts, even if there is never a trial where they can stand and defend themselves according to rules of fair trial.